Open your Bibles to Matthew 27, verses 50 through 53. We're trying out a new device tonight. Something I can scribble on while I'm teaching, if it's necessary. Not a blackboard, more like a digital board. And hopefully it works. Open your Bibles to Matthew 27, verses 50 through 53. Verse 50 reads, Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. The spirit, it's a better translation. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain, from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection. After Jesus resurrected, others resurrected also, and went into the holy city and appeared unto many. Why did that not have such a huge impact? You ever stop to think about that? I've combed through every historical account around that time period that I can find. I've read just about everything I could read from the time period about 28 AD to 36 AD. And it just marvels me that verse 53, and I'm reading correctly, just like you are, and came out of the graves after his resurrection. Whose resurrection? Jesus. And went into the holy city, Jerusalem, and appeared unto not a few, it says unto many. To me, whether you believed in Jesus or not, to see, who are they appearing to? Probably to friends, relatives. That would make a huge impact on me. Why did it get noticed? Why hasn't there been volumes of stories told and written down about what these people experienced when they saw their dead ones, loved ones, friends, alive? Doesn't make any sense to me. Why there's not documentation concerning what we read here in this verse, verse 53. Now, the only thing that I have concluded, and quite frankly, I haven't found anyone else that has come to this conclusion. And I'm not saying it's the only reason, but I think it's a very big reason why more is not written about and recorded when it did happen concerning verse 53. And many bodies of the saints which slept arose. Why? I think the key to understanding this is found in the previous verse. Verse 51. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. Israel has earthquakes. Nothing new there. There are some recorded earthquakes in the BC area before Christ, and there's earthquakes since Christ. Quite a few of them. There was an earthquake in 31 AD, and there's an earthquake, I'm talking about significant earthquakes, in 33 AD. Because it says in verse 51, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. The reason why, and there was considerable destruction on the temple, both in the 31 and 33 AD earthquakes. One of those earthquakes produced, according to the records, approximately 30,000 deaths. Now think with me. 30,000 deaths. That's a lot of people dying from an earthquake in Jerusalem. Whether it's 30,000 all in Jerusalem or 30,000 people dead which counts Jerusalem plus the surrounding areas, it doesn't matter. Even if it was 10,000 people in Jerusalem, the cities were not that big like we have big cities today. 10,000 would be a very considerable amount of deaths. I think the last thing people would be concerned with, probably, or they just haven't had the time to deal with it or even notice it, is because of the destruction that did happen and the deaths that did occur during these earthquakes. And the earthquakes were not the only thing. That went on at the death of our Savior. Other things were happening also. Go to the screen. We've been trying to figure out the end from the beginning. Can we get a proximity of when that end should take place? I have said God's timeline is 7,000 years. 7,000 years. From beginning to the end. Not the end of our existence, but the timeline that He set forth, that we could find in the Scriptures. Now, let's just assume for now, this is 4000 BC. And this is 2000 AD. Somewhere around here is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, We don't know exactly when God's timeline of this 7,000 year timeline began. We're just, right now, just assuming it was around 4,000 BC. If you go with Usher, Bishop Usher's date, it's 4004 BC. We know Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection took place, if you go according to the scholars and you believe what they are putting out, is somewhere between 28 AD and 36 AD. Now, if one day equals 1,000 years, we know 4 days went by from the beginning of time, when God first created this world, until the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If we could get close to the actual date of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then work back 4,000 years, instead of going this way with it, go this way with it, going back from the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, then maybe we can get close to when the timeline started. Now, it raises another question. Does the timeline of this 7,000 years start from the first minute of day one? Or this timeline start when Adam sinned? That's what we've got to try to figure out if we can. Now, when did he sin? How long did he exist before he sinned? Before he ate that forbidden piece of fruit? Was it 50? 100 years? 10 years? Now, we have to take in consideration, I'm not going to do it tonight, Jesus lived about 33 and a half years before his death, burial, and resurrection. Correct? Could it be possible that Adam sinned when he was about 33 and a half years? Is there a connection? And if there is a connection, why is there a connection? And what does that mean? What does that mean? Does it have any significance? And then, could it be possible, once we figure out this timeline by going backwards in time, oh, I just hit a button. Let me see if I can get out of it. There you go. Still learning how to use this thing. If we can go back in time, then can we get, like I said, an approximate date of when the 7,000 year timeline began? And once we got this figured out, as best as we can, then how much time do we have from this point, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, until the end? We know 2000 AD, ain't it? That timeline came and went. A lot of people in the religious world were giving out the warnings that 2000 AD would be it. They missed the other marks, but this had to be it. if God has a 7,000-year timeline, and if he does have a 7,000-year timeline, if the world started around 4000 BC, then by the time you get to 2000 AD, that's 6,000 years. One day equals 1,000 years. That's 6 days of God's timeline completed. And then we move on to another timeline with additional another 1,000 years, approximately. You got that? Oh, I confused everybody already. Well, we know the 2000 AD timeline came and went. He didn't come back for us, and we're still in this miserable existence of these last days that seems just to get worse, even though it's not robbing us of our joy, because our hope and faith is in Jesus Christ. It still saddens me to see the world rapidly deteriorating in these last years before his return, both times. So, that's where we're at, folks. We're trying to figure out this. Now, if anybody tells you they could pinpoint it with 100% accuracy, when two things, the return for the church and the return that brings judgment. I'm telling you, proceed with caution. Proceed with caution. Now, in previous teachings, I said if you take this period that we're looking at, the death, burial, resurrection, that it was somewhere between 32 AD through 34 AD. Some believe it's 30 AD, 29 AD, 31 AD, 32 AD, all the way up to 36 AD. And they have strong arguments, all of them. I don't question that. This is approximation. It's going to fall somewhere, in my opinion, 32 to 34 AD. But if it doesn't, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. Maybe it is 31 AD. Or one of those other dates. When you can get within a few years using any timeline, you're doing good. Because I'm not even going to get into, in this discussion, anything that brings up how calendars are off, which could skew all these numbers, whether slightly or considerably. There's a lot more to it, my friends, than just reading a couple lines here or one book there that has to go into all this. And I'm just giving you a general summary of what this is like. When you start digging in, start studying, and start trying to figure out where we are in God's timeline. Now, you come back to me. Let's read tonight a few things about what happened at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And can they point us to events that we know that took place in the Scriptures and give us some type of dates that we can plug into the timeline to get a better approximation of when all these things took place, so we can go backwards to move forwards, and then we can go forward and go backward. we could see the end from the beginning. Now, this is an interesting piece. It speaks about Jesus and his death and how everything was shaken. A number of very unusual events connected with the temple have been reported to have taken place. If not the specific moment of Jesus' death, at least very close to it. Several references in the Talmud describe the events taking place, quote, 40 years before the destruction of the temple, end of quote, which took place in AD 70. At least 6 different extra-biblical sources have recorded one or more supernatural occurrences. Some of those sources are the Jerusalem Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, the Midrash Rabbah, the Wars of the Jews by Josephus, the Lives of the Prophets, and so on. Perhaps the most significant and interesting of those are 1. The breaking and falling to the floor of the massive lintel which held the veil. 2. Large doors in front of the curtain opening by themselves. 3. The chief lamp being extinguished. And 4. The Sanhedrin moved from their special hall. Let's look at number 1, which is the breaking and falling to the floor of the massive lintel which held the veil. The Bible records that the curtains were torn from top to bottom, completely severed. Other sources add that the estimated 60,000 pound, now that's heavy, friends, 60,000 pound lintel that held up the curtain splintered and fell to the ground. It is almost certain that the other damage would have been created by this colossal crash. Curtain torn and lintel broken. The earthquake not only shook up the outside, but it shook the internal essence as well. In fact, both the earthquakes in 31 AD and 33 AD did so much damage to the Holy Temple, there are certain areas they couldn't use, and Herod made a commitment to do the repairs. Columns and everything were falling apart. He never got to it. Year after year went by, all the way up to 70 AD. The repairs never happened. The repairs never happened. After that quake, whether it was 31 AD or 33 AD, or possibly even another quake that was in 32 AD, it doesn't matter which quake did it at this point. All we know, the damage was done. It never did get repaired. Where was I? The moment of Jesus' death altered everything in creation. The foundations were shaken. The business of the world took on a complete rebuild. It was more than a change, it was a rebirth. The way God would relate to his creation took on a new life. The torn curtain was a miraculous sign that we now have free access to God. We can come boldly and without fear. Number 2, the large doors in front of the curtain opening by themselves. Sounds spooky, doesn't it? The huge doors that stood in front of the curtain, which were closed each evening and opened each morning, opened on their own. Well, you might be thinking, well, maybe a strong wind came by, or the earthquake just skewed the hinges somehow enough to, or misaligned the hinges where it would cause it to open on its own on occasion. Hang on. You can't dismiss it that easily. These doors, according to the Talmud, took 20 men to open or close. But now they open on their own accord. Think about that. It took 20 men to open these doors. Most people never even heard of that. And now, it's not no strong wind. Now these doors were opening on their own, with no assistance, at least seen assistance. Was it because they were attached to the lintel, which was now destroyed? Or was this a miraculous sign that God now comes to us through the veil of flesh? The door is open. You can preach messages from that. You don't access God now by going through those doors. You access God now by going through Jesus. He is the door. And He has opened the door for that access. Not only do we have access to Him, but God's Spirit now has access into our hearts, and through them, direct connection to the creation, just like in the Garden of Eden. The curtain no longer keeps us out, and neither does it keep God in. 40 years before the temple was destroyed, or in, 40 years before the temple was destroyed, the gates of Hekel, the holy place, opened by themselves until Rabbi Yohan Zakkai rebuked him. Z-A-K-K-A-I is his last name. The gates, saying, Hekel, Hekel, why alarmest thou us? We know that thou art destined to be destroyed. And that's in the Talmud, Yoma, Y-O-M-A, 39b. Let's look at number 3. Which was number 3? Number 3 was the chief lamp being extinguished. The chief light of the menorah went out. It had miraculously continued to burn. Continuously is the key word there. To burn from evening until the next evening, for as long as the priest could remember. The other lights were in need of cleaning and refilling at the end of the morning sacrifices. But this one continued on through the day. It was the same size as the others and held the same amount of oil, approximately 5.5 ounces. A double manifestation of grace there. It was considered a miraculous sign to the priests of God's presence. This lamp was the this lamp was the one they relit all of the others from. It was the chief lamp, also called the western light. God's Spirit had shifted from external direction through a light shining on the law. He was now running His law on the hearts of His people. Illumination from within instead of without. He had left the religion of old and had established a new covenant. Let me read you something from the Jewish Encyclopedia. The cleaning and refilling of the lamps, except the two most easterly, were performed by a priest every morning. If the priest found them extinguished, he relighted them. The two eastern lamps were left burning until after the morning service, and where they then cleaned and refilled. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. The first word, Ner, the Ner Ha, H-A, Ma, M-A, Araba, A-R-A-B-I, Arabi, also called Ner, second word Elohim, the Ner Elohim, was left burning all day and was refilled in the evening. It served to light all the lamps. The Ner Ha-Rabbi contained no more oil than the other lamps, a half long measured. One log contains a liquid of 6 eggs, sufficient to last during the longest winter night. Yet by a miracle, that lamp regularly burned till the following evening. It has been taught, 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the western light went out. The crimson thread remained crimson, and the lot for the Lord always came up in the left hand. They would close the gates of the temple by night and get up in the morning and find them wide open. Said Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai, O temple, why do you frighten us? We know that you will end up destroyed. For it has been said, open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars, in Zechariah 11:1. Interesting, isn't it, folks? We have doors, we have lamps, we have veil being rent, lintels falling down. Let's get to number 4, which was the Sanhedrin moved from their special hall. The evidence surrounding the Sanhedrin's mysterious and sudden move is somewhat circumstantial, like much understanding that has been gleaned from the early days of Christianity. However, it is reasonable to conclude that after the earthquake that shook the Temple Mount, at the time the curtain was torn and the lintel crashed to the floor, the hall of hewn stone, H-E-W-N, the magnificent meeting hall of the 71 members of the Sanhedrin, was damaged and no longer usable. Some say it was the last time, if Jesus' trial was held in that hall, it was the last trial that ever was held in that hall before its damage done by that earthquake. The Talmud in Josephus tells us that 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the Sanhedrin stopped meeting in this beautiful room in the temple and moved to a space in the marketplace. Now some say Jesus' trial was not in this hall because Jesus' trial was at night, and according to the Sanhedrin rules, you couldn't try anybody at night. Well, this wasn't anybody they were trying, and their hatred towards Jesus was so intense. It's not far-fetched to believe that they would break the rule on that occasion if they had the opportunity to eliminate Jesus' life and put an end to what they believe was blasphemy. Now, whether it happened there or not is not even the point, to tell you the truth. The one thing you can take from this, it was the last trial, whether there or not, before it was destroyed. Whether it was Jesus' trial or not, there was not going to be any trials there any longer by the Sanhedrin members, because it was destroyed and unusable. Now, where was I? They moved to the marketplace. Because the destruction of the temple was in the year AD 70, that indicates this move took place in or close to the year Jesus was crucified. Along with this move, they stopped judging capital offenses. Was this damaged room and lost authority to sentence people to death a sign that God was either through with them or that he was removing them for the role they played in crucifying his son? In the Talmud, the Shabbat 15a, it says, 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the Sanhedrin was banished from the chamber of hewn stone and sat in the trading station on the Temple Mount. If an earthquake of the magnitude capable of breaking the stone lintel at the top of the entrance to the holy place was occurring at the exact time of Christ's death, then what would such an earthquake have done to the chamber of hewn stones, a vaulted and column structure? No more than 40 yards away from where the stone lintel fell and the curtain was torn in two. There is every reason to believe, though the evidence is circumstantial, that the chamber of hewn stones was so damaged in the same earthquake that it became structurally unsafe from that time forward. Something like this had to have happened because the Sanhedrin would not have left this majestic chamber to take up residence in an insignificant trading place unless something approaching this explanation took place. If this is actually what happened, and it probably did in my opinion, we then have a most remarkable witness that God the Father engineered every action happening on the day of Christ's trial and crucifixion. It means that the judgment made by the official Sanhedrin against Jesus within the chamber of hewn stones was the last judgment ever given by the official Sanhedrin in their majestic chambers within the temple. It would show that God the Father demonstrated by the earthquake at Christ's death that the sentence of Sanhedrin against Jesus would be the last judgment it would ever make in that authorized place. Given the uncertainty of the rabbinic traditions, along with their occasional use of mystical and exaggerated language to convey thoughts, and by the way, using some of those sources can have their dates off somewhat also. That is not something that's new. Not only they sometimes possibly exaggerated what went on, but their dates were not as accurate. So that's why I mentioned earlier, anyone that's going to say this is the exact date, I'm 100% for sure, question that. There has to be room, in that case, some flexibility given. Because we're not eyewitnesses. And all we can go on is what we have that's been recorded. And there's sometimes different opinions exactly what happened and when it happened. But that's for another time. Accuracy of extra biblical sources must also be questioned. Accuracy is especially difficult to establish when the very events being examined are of a supernatural origin. As such, defy reason to begin with. However, with those things in mind, the number of recorded witnesses of these amazing events leads us to the conclusion of God doing a great and wonderful thing to punctuate this most holy and perfect sacrifice and the birth of a new age, a new covenant. Do I believe these things happen? Yes, there's enough proof. I'm not going to read all the sources. Just don't have the time. But the thing is, what I want to point out is, somewhere, in my opinion, between 31 and 34 AD, the death, burial, and resurrection took place. In my opinion, the reason why not any recorded information about people coming out of their graves and walking in the city, the holy city, is recorded because at that time when this was all taking place, not just the temple being damaged, just imagine homes, residents, businesses. Just imagine up to 30,000 people dead in the city. What do you think is going to be recorded? The thing that brought the most destruction. News is the same now as it was back then. especially if the ones that came out of the grave didn't stay around. They were resurrected. And they probably about it, they went to the next destination that was not part of this planet. And they were gone. Who knows how long they were even around? It could have just been moments. And it probably was explained away. And it is certain that the religious Jews, even if they had even loved ones that raised from the dead that they knew or friends, are definitely not going to be recorded because they're still in denial that Jesus was the Son of God. They were in denial that he was the Savior of this world. But the reason I bring all this stuff up, because we could get close to an approximation date of when the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus took place. And with that, the centerpiece of the timeline, we can now work in both directions. Backwards to find approximate beginning date, moving forwards, looking for approximate end date in God's timeline. Now, the variable is, we always have the consideration of date keeping and calendar keeping, which also skew the numbers. And that's why I told you, and I told you before, if you think you get an exact date out of me, you're wrong, because there's too much variables in there. But we can know when it's close, is what I'm saying. And that's what we're looking at. And if you understand what I'm saying, I want to hear from you while they play a song.